let's go to the cinema tonight. A friend of mine suggested. Lord of the Rings is showing. I had no idea what the Lord of the Rings was, but I thought I'd go, even if it was just for the popcorn. Well, 3 hours into the film, just before the credits rolled, I turned to Martin and said, I don't get it. It just doesn't make sense. That's because it's a trilogy, Jane. There's more to come. There's still another 2 films yet. More to come? Good grief. The first 3 hours was enough. There's more to come. Well, you could say that that's the message in the passage that we're looking at tonight. If you haven't got your Bible with you, then pause the video, go and find it, and read John chapter 21, verses 1 to 17. But don't forget to come back and press the play button. John chapter 21. I love this story. It's one of my favourite passages. It's full of action, drama, and all kinds of emotion. Resignation, sulkiness, agonising, humour and surprise. And it wasn't just the fish on the barbecue that got a grilling. Peter got one too. This is post-Easter, remember, and this is the 3rd appearance of the risen Jesus to his disciples. They've all dispersed by this point, disillusioned, confused, fearful for their lives and not sure where they were going. In John chapter 21, we see 7 of them returning to what they know best, fishing. The stranger on the shore calls out to them, tells them what to do, and then 153 fish later, I wonder if they counted them all one by one, they realise it's Jesus who's the one standing there cooking breakfast for them. And then we have it. What must have seemed to Peter like a really tense conversation. But it's not a conversation in isolation. It's actually the 3rd act in another trilogy, a trilogy of events which actually starts way back in chapter 13 of John's Gospel, the night of the Last Supper, John chapter 13 and verse 36 and 37. Take a look. Halfway through the evening, we have this great declaration by Peter, the second part of verse 37. I'll follow you all right, says Peter. In fact, I'd lay down my life for you. Yeah, right. That's the 1st act of the trilogy. And then a couple of hours later, chapter 18, verses 25 to 27. Chapter 18, 25 to 27. We watch as Peter helplessly fails. Sure, he follows Jesus, but when the crunch comes, it all goes horribly wrong. 3 times he denies even knowing Jesus. Peter does what we all do at times. He messes up. Oh, how the memory of that night must have seared into his conscience. If he's anything like me, then he would have been angry with himself. He'd have felt like he was a failure, and he would have played it over and over again to see where he went wrong. That was Act 2 of the trilogy. And now, back on the beach in John 21 and tonight's reading. A lot had happened in the last week. Jesus had been brutally tortured and killed, and I'm sure Peter would have beaten himself up time and time again in the days since. But he's still a leader of men, if you notice. He's the one who sets the example. I'm going out fishing. Throughout the Gospels, Peter is always the first to respond. He wades in with both feet every time. It may have been John who called out to the others on this occasion, "It is the Lord." But it's Peter who puts his clothes on and jumps into the water to sprint to where Jesus is. He had an urgency to be with him. As well as beating himself up, Peter had learned something in the meantime. He'd learned that once you had been with Jesus, your life can never be the same again in a good way. You simply can't go back to where you were. Fishing didn't work for him anymore. Jesus had called him to something different. There was more to come. He may have made certain confessions with his lips. "I'll follow you wherever," he might have said. But Peter is about to be reminded that the measure of his love for Jesus is not based on what he says with his lips, but by the conduct of his life. Jesus' calling had grabbed Peter, and Jesus wasn't going to let him go. Jesus had more for Peter's life. Just like he did with Peter, he never takes his eyes from us either. Somehow, in the background, Jesus is always drawing us to himself. He's always keeping the calling alive. As the smell of the barbecue wafted across the beach, I wonder if Peter saw himself once again as he was in that courtyard the night before Jesus died. There'd been a fire burning there too, and Peter had warmed his hands around it. Was this fire that morning on the beach deliberate? Was it so that Jesus could very tenderly take Peter to the place where he'd made his mistakes in order to bring about his healing? It's possible because all the while Peter still held on to the hurt and the guilt. He couldn't be fully free to become the person that Jesus wanted him to be. We can all recognise that, can't we? We hold on to things too. We allow things to smoulder. We nurture old wounds, but it gets in the way. It interrupts our progress. The three questions that Jesus asked Peter that morning in verses 15 to 17 of John 21 enabled his complete restoration. Remember, there had been 3 denials. Peter hadn't understood that Jesus' actions on the cross meant that he could be forgiven. That's what it was all about. It was all about love in capital letters. No wonder love was the principal subject of the questions that Jesus asked. Hear this. Failure doesn't need to be final. Yet many of us don't see it like that. We give up on ourselves or we give up on others. Do you want the good news? Jesus doesn't. What happens here on the beach that morning shows us that failure is an event, not a destination. It doesn't need to be final. Jesus still had something more for Peter. But before he could realise that, Peter had to learn that if he was to be restored, then he and Jesus needed to have a heart-to-heart at the point of his failure. And so he takes Peter to where his pain is, as he so often does with us. He asks Peter the very question which is at the heart of it all. Do you love me? He doesn't ask, are you sorry? And neither does he ask, will you promise never to do it again? He simply asks, do you love me? Funnily enough, Jesus doesn't ask those things of us either. Although ultimately he doesn't ask for it he doesn't ask primarily for our obedience. He wants it ultimately. What he asks for, though, is for our heart. Do you love me? Once we give our heart, all the rest will follow as a natural consequence. With each question that Jesus asks Peter, there's a fresh challenge. If you love me, Peter, I've not finished with you yet. Peter, it's time to learn how to be a shepherd, how to lead people to me. It's time to learn how to feed those who are young in their faith. It's time to learn how to look after them. This is what it's all about. If you're going to follow me, Peter, if you're going to do what I'm calling you to do, if there's to be more to come, then you must love me. That's where there's no room for compromise. You must love. It's as if Jesus is saying that love will shape everything that you do. It will help to determine what's important and what's not. Will you mess up from time to time? Yeah, of course you will. But I've shown you the pattern for forgiveness, says Jesus. I've shown you what it means to be healed. Follow that. Peter learned that day that by some strange economy of God, the very fact that we have failed is often the qualifying factor of his being able to use us. Because it is in failing that we discover more of God and ourselves. It's often because we've been hurt or experienced pain that he can use us. Peter learned that day that failure wasn't final. What was the secret of the more to come? Is the fact that somewhere deep inside Peter there was this love for Jesus. Jesus knew that, and all he had to do on the beach that day was to draw it out so that Peter could see it for himself. The truth is, somewhere deep inside all of us, there's a love for Jesus. And though we may have let him down, he wants us to discover that love, just as he did Peter. He wants to give us the chance to express it, to heal the hurts and failures of the past, and to give us a new work in bringing that same liberating love to others. Peter's reinstatement is our reinstatement. Peter's restoration is our restoration. His healing is our healing. Peter's commissioning is our commissioning. Do you love me? Jesus asks. He knows that we'll make mistakes, but he also knows what we can be, and he's already on our case. Just like he did to Peter that day, the same Jesus pursues us. He has forgiven us. He heals us, and he fills us with a deep, deep love that will release us. I wonder if he's asking you this evening, do you love me? Do you truly love me? Because if you do, then know this: he's got so much more for you still to come. Take him at his word. Amen.